Welcome back to the home of Peter Pan lore and Peter Pan facts here on YouTube! And today we're bringing you another episode of the 120 Years of Peter Pan Costume series. And today we are going to be talking about reimaginings of the story and what costumes they gave to their lead character, Peter Pan. So far in this series, we have started from the very beginning. We have looked at the stage costumes and how they have evolved from the autumnal reds through to the leafy greens. We have looked at different adaptations of the story. We have looked at musical versions. We have looked at how the costumes have evolved and changed over the years. And now we're looking at the reimaginings, just some of them. I have chosen 4 reimaginings of this story, which we're going to talk about today, and I will do them one at a time. I may compare them a little bit to each other as well, but predominantly I will talk about them one after the other, and then the other, and then the other. So here are the 4 reimaginings of the story of Peter Pan whose costumes we're going to talk about today. The first one is the 1991 movie Hook, which I've talked about quite a lot on this channel and my other one and over on TikTok, so we'll try to avoid talking about the story too much. We'll just focus on the costume. Next up we have the 2015 movie Pan. I don't think this one will take very long, and if you know why, you know why. After that, we have the 2011 miniseries Neverland. This is another one that probably won't take too long either. And then to finish off the video, we have the 2015 ITV movie Peter and Wendy. As always in this series, what I'm going to be looking at are 3 different things. Number 1 is how well the costume looks just as a costume. Number 2 is how well the costume relates back to its character, Peter Pan, and of course the source material of the play and the novel. And number 3 is looking at what inspiration might have been drawn to create such a costume, looking back at the costumes of history, particularly the early stage ones, and any other costumes that came after it. Alright, let's delve into the video then. The next part of 120 years of Peter Pan costumes, and this time we're starting with the movie Hook. This costume was designed by Anthony Powell and was worn by the actor Robin Williams. I am choosing to include this costume on the list, although technically it shouldn't be here, because this is not the character of Peter Pan, this is the character of Peter Banning, a severely troubled man who needs to get some therapy and actually talk to his children. But anyway, we're not talking about the story and the plot, we are here for the costume. Although the plot is slightly relevant as to a little bit about why I don't like this costume. I'll get that out of the way to begin with. So, the plot reason why I don't like this costume is because it is an adult wearing it. Now, on the stage, this is different. On the stage, Peter is played by grown-up actors all the time, and within reason, adults can still play the role of Peter Pan. But this movie, Hook, very deliberately has a middle-aged man playing the role. And so immediately the costume feels and looks wrong because it's not being worn by someone who's playing as the child Peter Pan. It's being worn by a very troubled adult. So immediately it's on the back foot there. But ignoring the plot, which is very hard for me to do when talking about the movie Hook. I hope you appreciate this, guys. Let's talk about those 3 things then. What do I think of the costume just as a costume? How do I think about it as a Peter Pan costume? And how does it relate back to other Peter Pan costumes over the last 120 years? We'll start with section number 1 then. What is it like just as a costume? And I answer this question as a cosplayer who makes a lot of costumes myself. The problem I have with it is that it's very one note, and I kind of don't want to say it, but it's a little bland. It's all pretty much one colour. The only pops of colour that you get, and I say pop, and that's pushing it a little bit, are the leaves that cascade down the front. Some of them are in a slightly different shade of green and brown. But when you look at the ensemble as a whole, the shorts, the t-shirt on the top, the leaves around the collar, down the sleeves, they're all the same colour. It's all this sort of browny beigey shade of browny not quite green, and it really doesn't feel particularly inspired. It looks like chopped up pajamas, and I think the biggest reason why I couldn't see any of the detailing in the movie is because it's all the same colour. These leaves that go around the collar and down the sleeves, I had no idea that they were there, because when you're watching the film they disappear. And this is a costume that was made for a film. They should have been aware of how it was going to look under movie lights. And because in a film you can play with the saturation and the colours and the contrast, really and truly this should have looked a lot better than it does. But It just doesn't. So simply just as a costume, it's very bland and one note and not particularly inspiring. But how does it look then as a Peter Pan costume? And again, we're hand waving the fact that it is not actually a Peter Pan costume. Middle-aged man having a breakdown costume. The leaves are beautiful details, despite the fact that you can't see them because they are in the wrong colour, aka the same colour, and get washed out by everything. They're still there. I love the little cascadey leaves down the front, the little lace-up bits. I like that there are at least 2 different layers of leaves going around the collar and down the sleeves as well. I like how choppy the top is. I like that there's choppy bottoms as well. And you guys know this about me already. I like a good Peter Pan shoe, and these shoes are pretty fun as well. The belt is quite nice as well. I like that it ties it all together and it isn't just left too baggy. But ultimately and truly, it is a very bland, blank costume, which really doesn't give very much, especially when comparing it to the character of Peter Pan himself. But perhaps then we've solved the mystery. Perhaps this is supposed to be a bland, basic, boring, for lack of a better word, version of a Peter Pan costume because it's going to a Mr. Banning and it's not going to a Peter Pan at all. Perhaps this is to show that despite trying, it is still an adult attempting and failing to be this person that they are not anymore. So I'm going to choose to believe that. I'm going to choose to believe that it was deliberately made to be this washed out colour that you can't really see any details of because it's no longer the actual Peter Pan at all. But now let's wrap up the movie Hook's Peter Pan costume and compare it to the other costumes that came before it. Perhaps they drew some inspiration from them, perhaps they didn't. I can definitely compare this to the greener, leafier costumes as worn by Maud Adams, partly because of its colouring and partly because of where the leaves sit. But I also think it could have drawn some inspiration from the Jean Forbes Robertson and the Nina style of costumes as well. While it's not autumnal, it's certainly not green enough to be completely green, but it's definitely not autumnal enough to be red or orange either. But again, with the big leafy collars and the jaggedy edges, the cascading leaves, while it doesn't go just over one shoulder like the ones that Nina and Jean Forbes Robertson wore did, it does have the sort of cascading effect. And I really do enjoy that as a look. It's just a shame that we can't see it very much because there's no real pops of colour to it. I definitely think that you can look at it and compare it to those stage costumes, and if someone said, we drew inspiration from these, I would believe them and I'd be able to see it translated here. Overall then, I find this costume very bland, very basic, and it could have been elevated if they just played around with those colours a lot more. I also really wish they had given Robin Williams a hat. I think it would have solved some of the dilemma of middle-aged man with thinning hair wearing a Peter Pan costume. I think it could have helped, but at the same time, put sprinkles on a turd and it's still going to be a turd at the end of the day. I don't think it's the worst of the costumes, but it certainly is in the very bottom set for me. It's bland, it's beige, it's boring, and it's all the things that Peter Pan is not. Slight side note here, I actually think that Rufio's costume would fit the character of Peter Pan far better, and if they were redoing that movie, I would simply have Rufio playing Peter Pan, and Mr. Banning's character would be Peter's long-lost brother. That would make the whole story way more interesting. But anyway, moving on. Next up, we're going to talk about the movie Pan. As I said before, this will probably be very quick. Why is that? Well, to put it bluntly, there isn't a Peter Pan costume in this movie. Let's get into it. The costumes in the movie Pan were designed by Jacqueline Durran, and the Peter Pan one was worn by Levi Miller. And let's have a look at it, shall we? Part 1. As just a costume. What does it look like? Well, it looks like a white vest top, some suspenders and some trousers. It would not look out of place in one of the stage shows of Oliver Twist. You could probably get away with it if you were in Les Mis. Gustave could wear it in Love Never Dies. You could also wear it in a production of Sweeney Todd. The kids in Narnia could wear it. Actually, I think Eustace wears something similar in one of the movies, but they would wear nicer shirts than this. Ultimately, what I'm trying to say is that as a costume, it's not particularly imaginative, creative, or interesting, and so we're going to move straight along to the how does it fare as a Peter Pan costume? Well, funnily enough, because it lacks any interest or imagination, it's also a pretty poor Peter Pan costume. There is nothing about this costume that reads as Peter Pan at all. If you put this costume in a lineup with all the other ones I'm going to talk about in the 120 Years of Peter Pan series, it would look out of place. And that's because it doesn't look like anything that Peter Pan would wear. Now, this isn't to say that Peter Pan can't wear a shirt or suspenders or trousers. We've seen him wear similar things to this before. In the Goes Wrong show, the Peter Pan Goes Wrong performance, he is wearing a top and trousers, but they managed to make it look like something that Peter Pan would wear. It's not just a top and pants, it is pants with leafy details in it and stripes and stitching. In the movie Pan, there's no extra details, there's no leaves, there's no anything, there's no autumnal colours, there's no spider webs, there's no leaves in green or any other colours. There's nothing interesting at all. There's nothing to even pick him out from the other people in the movie. You could not tell this is Peter Pan except for the fact that he has the word Peter Pan written underneath him in the cast list. The most Peter Pan thing about this costume are the tiny, tiny panpipes that he has on a necklace around his neck, but that doesn't do anything to help. It doesn't look like Peter Pan. It's not anything that he would wear. If he did wear it, it would be covered in leaves and ripped. At least rip it, make it look interesting, but no. Part of this is plot related because this Peter Pan isn't actually from the Neverland at all, and so he is essentially just a normal person, which begs the question of why they even did it. But anyway, no, as a Peter Pan costume, it doesn't look like a Peter Pan costume. So moving swiftly on to part number 3, how does it compare to 120 years of other Peter Pan costumes? Well, it doesn't. It's making the Hook movie's costume look pretty good right about now. It's not a Peter Pan costume, it's just trousers, suspenders, and a white shirt. At one point, at the very, very end, he does wear a very strange hat that looks a little bit like a swan is poking out of his head. That, I will grant you, is at least an attempt to be slightly more Peter Pan-ish. The costume itself bears no resemblance to any other Peter Pan costumes over 120 years because it's not one. There's nothing Peter Pan about it. There's no leaves and green, nothing autumnal, nothing cascading over the shoulders. There's nothing. It is a vest, suspenders, and pants. Moving on. Next up, we're going to talk about the Neverland miniseries. The costume design in this was by Reimagined, and the Peter Pan one was worn by Charlie Rowe. Unfortunately, once again, I think this is going to be a very quick one, but let's do it anyway. Number 1, how is it just as a costume? Well, on the positive side, it has more details to it and more layers than the Pan movie costume, but unfortunately it falls into the same trap of just being not very interesting to look at. It does have some more layers. At certain points it has a neckerchief to go with the white shirt and the plain trousers. It also has a waistcoat, and it's got a big jacket over the top as well. Unfortunately though, much like the one from the movie Pan, this could fit in just about anywhere. This could be worn by any of the Pevensey children, any of the other kids who go to Narnia. It could be worn by someone in Sweeney Todd, Les Mis, Mary Poppins, Oliver Twist, any pretty much Dickens story at all. It has that distinct lack of imagination, again, in a character like Peter Pan who so much deserves a very imaginative and creative costume, and it just doesn't have any. I did get a little bit ahead of myself then. I'm supposed to be looking at it as just a costume. So in terms of just as a costume, it's fine. It's got details and layers, but you can't really tell where it fits. It could belong just about anywhere in anything of this particular historical period. So it looks fine, but it's not particularly interesting. Which leads us into the how is it as a Peter Pan costume, and as I accidentally already started saying, the problem with this one, much like the movie Pan, is that it doesn't look like a Peter Pan costume. It's not one. The only reason it counts as a Peter Pan costume is because the character wearing it is called Peter Pan. But again, if you put it into a lineup with all the other 120 years of Peter Pan costumes, you wouldn't know that it was one. It would look like the odd one out and it wouldn't fit. So yeah, once again, it's a complete fail of a Peter Pan costume. Perfectly nice costume, just it's not a Peter Pan one. Let's then wrap up this section and compare it to 120 years of other Peter Pan costumes. Well, ironically, because we talked about Pan first, there is a Peter Pan costume that you can compare it to, which is the one from the movie Pan, but that's not a compliment, because neither of them look like Peter Pan costumes. They don't fit. They're not something that is his at all. It doesn't read Peter Pan in any way. It's just bland and boring. And again, we're making the Hook costume look so much better right now. So, yeah, that's pretty much it. This series is okay. It's got some interesting plot beats, but in terms of Peter Pan costumes, yeah, big, massive disappointment for this one and the movie Pan. They just, yeah, they only count in name only. Alright, let's move on to the last costume we're going to talk about today, and this one is from the ITV movie Peter and Wendy. The costumes in this were designed by Elise Simon, and the Peter Pan one was worn by Zach Sutcliffe. Let's start with the first one then. How does it look just as a costume? Well, especially in compared to the last two we looked at, it's certainly more visually interesting. Ignoring all the Peter Pan content for the moment and just looking at it as a costume, there are bits and pieces going on. There's dirt and smudges, it's ripped at the hems, it's got really interesting colours and depth and textures, the hood goes round and there's like bits of fur and leaves dangling down around it. It's giving sort of Lord of the Flies more than it's necessarily giving Peter Pan, or I would actually say one of the Lost Boys. If you told me this was a Lost Boy, I would believe this in pretty much any adaptation of Peter Pan. So ultimately, it looks more interesting than the last two, but it still isn't really giving Peter Pan. Moving into that, it's not giving Peter Pan because, well, it's still a little bit too plain. Now, the reason for this is probably because Peter Pan in the ITV Peter and Wendy special really isn't the most important character. We're actually focused on another main character instead, and the journey of children going through Great Ormond Street Hospital. So I don't mind too much that he is given a backseat in not just costuming but in the story as well, because it does fit there. Unlike with Pan and the Neverland miniseries, where he was supposed to be Peter Pan and the main character, in this he's not. So giving him a slightly more subdued costume so that he can appear and disappear and fade in and out of the background, that's fine. It does have at least some variation in colour compared to the Hook one, for example, but it is still a lot of beige and browns, and there isn't a lot of pop to it. I do enjoy that it has bits of detailing though. There are some rips towards the bottom, the trousers look more interesting, the sword he has is also very cool, and the bits of fur and the leaves and things, while they are a bit higgledy-piggledy all over the place and in places just kind of look like they've been stuck on, it does still look like someone who lives and exists in nature, so I can give them a little bit of a pass for that. Not completely Peter Pan, it's reading definitely more Lost Boy, but it is still, you know, Neverland adjacent. And finally, let's move on to talking about it in comparison to the other 120 years of Peter Pan costumes. Well, at least if you put this one in a lineup of Peter Pan costumes, I might only think, oh, they've mixed up a Lost Boy in here somewhere. At least it would look like it still belonged in the same story, as opposed to the two from Pan and Neverland. The hair is quite interesting. I like Peter having a side shave, partly because I've got one, and I like that it's sort of scruffy and all over the place. And ultimately, it's not the worst, especially compared to the rest of them on here. I think I prefer it to the movie Hook, actually. I wish that it had more leafy details. I wish that they'd done more with it. I think that they could have put more into the dirt, maybe even the shapes of leaves in the shadows of the dirt across his chest or something on the white shirt. But ultimately, I do like it probably the best out of the four we're talking about today. It doesn't necessarily draw inspiration from other Peter Pans. Possibly you could argue the stage costumes, the greener, leafier, Maud Adamsy ones, not so much for the colours, but for the leaves and the details. And then again, possibly for the much earlier ones from Nina and Jean Forbes Robertson. It's not autumnal, but it does have the scratchy and tattered shapes in it. So I can sort of see that if I squint a little bit. I think that overall, this costume from Peter and Wendy shows you how you can take the white shirt and plain trousers and instead of making it just look like any generic background character from any Dickens story ever, you can elevate it and make it look more like, if missing the mark of Peter Pan himself, at least look like someone who lives on the Neverland. This costume definitely could belong to a Lost Boy. It would slot right into almost any production of Peter Pan anywhere. However, it definitely isn't Peter enough to be Peter for me. And that wraps it up for this episode of 120 Years of Peter Pan Costumes. What did you think of the costumes featured in today's video? Any other reimaginings you'd like me to talk about? You will almost definitely find them in the next few episodes of 120 Years, so look out for those ones. Overall though, I think we have discovered that of the reimaginings of Peter Pan, the costumes have been a real big letdown, so let's hope that next month's episode has some better ones for us. Speaking of, what are we going to be looking at in next month's episode of 120 Years? Well, something that I actually only added recently to this list because a lot of you were talking about it in the comments and on my live the other day and on TikTok. So I have added this in as a bonus extra one. Video games. and different versions of the Peter Pan costumes worn by the animated video game characters of Peter Pan. Let me know if there's any specific ones you'd like me to mention next time in the comments down below as well. In the meantime, don't forget to hydrate. If you've got any other questions about Peter Pan and the world of the Neverland or costumes in general, chuck those in or head over to the TikTok page where you can chuck on questions as well. I love you all. Thank you so much for engaging with my content. Have a wonderful rest of your week. Goodbye! Whoa. Oh my Christ.